Okay, another lovely topic, lovely article. This one, am I recording? I'm recording. So here we are looking at the application of recent advances in climate adaptation research to urban heat risk management. This is led by Chandani Singh, the Indian superstar in the IPCC business. Wire provides these nice, relatively short review articles that are very useful for introducing the topic like this. It's called a perspective here, not a review, but nonetheless, I'm going to be brief as usual. It's a very nice article with lots of very nice references, and I'm just going to make it short, right? There is unequivocal evidence that anthropogenic climate change is supercharging temperature and precipitation regimes globally. One of the clearest signals of this is seen in current and projected increases in extreme heat, understood as changes in temperature maximums, longer duration heat waves, and higher nighttime temperatures. There are dynamics between all of those you can look up elsewhere on my channel. Extreme heat has substantial impacts on socio-ecological systems through direct impacts on human health and labor productivity, crop yields and water security, and second order impacts on infrastructure functioning and hazards such as increased fire and drought incidents. These impacts are differentiated and mediated by pre-existing vulnerabilities based on who you are, what you do, where you live, and your capacities to prepare for, prevent, cope with, and adapt to heat exposure. Nowhere are these increasing and differentiated impacts. Nowhere are these increasing and differentiated impacts of heat more visible than in populous, rapidly urbanizing regions. Urban centers contribute more to climate change, disproportionately more, let's say, and they have impacts on them that are also disproportionately high. Urban heat islands, urban heat waves, urban heat risk, urban floods, and so on and so forth. Obviously, informal housing, slums with mixed neighborhoods and facilities, infrastructure, everything makes vulnerabilities also very complicated in very small scales, right? Governments across the world are piloting and implementing heat management strategies, which are variously called heat health plans, heat action plans, heat resilience strategies, and so forth. Even though heat action plan can mean dealing with the events as they happen, whereas heat resilience means longer term plan to reduce the impacts and be prepared and resilient to the future heat waves, which are expected to get worse, of course. We argue that such actions and policy agendas can benefit from theoretical advances in the climate change vulnerability and adaptation literature. We synthesize 5 theoretical advances to highlight the need for suites of actions sequenced in pathways that are more sensitive to trade-offs, center equity as a normative goal of effective adaptation, acknowledge uncertainty and pre-existing differential vulnerabilities, leverage lessons from participatory adaptation planning, and are forward-looking and preparatory actions. We consolidate these advances and develop an approach to inform urban heat risk management. In case you are not already aware, vulnerability is made up of many things, like the kind of house you are living in, the kind of job you have, permanent contract, per capita income, education level, and so on. And exposure is again population density, infrastructure. So they are all subtly different. Various indices are chosen to compute and quantify these, and of course IPCC 5 defined risk as a multiplication of hazard, which comes from, let's say, heat waves, vulnerability and exposure, but in the current definition, response is also being added, because response such as these adaptation preparations can actually mitigate the overall risk, right? So this is a nice schematic infographic. Let's read the caption. Adapting to climate risks is a continuous process. Reading the figure from the inside outwards, the inner circle represents 5 frontiers in adaptation research that are key to risk management and adaptation. Advances in adaptation theory, numbered 1 to 5, include understanding risks as a complex. So it's not just one particular hazard and one risk. It is multiplier of many different aspects of hazard, location specific, outcome, vulnerabilities, differentiated vulnerabilities, which is about whether you are poor or rich, whether you have agency or not, and so on. Recognizing the context of differential vulnerability, adhering to values of justice and equity, developing solutions through pathways, approaches that prepare for decision making under uncertainty. There are controversies about whether these are the best or not, that I won't get into. And of course, participatory approaches to enable inclusive risk management. And here again, differentiated or differential vulnerability means who is going to participate and who is allowed to participate and who is not, can also be issues that contribute or exacerbate differential vulnerabilities. Together they have implications for adaptation action, as we'll see in the outermost circle. The 5 advances are depicted as slices of a larger pie to demonstrate that advances identified by the authors are a subset of the wider adaptation literature, which is the full circle. So let's go. We're trying to adapt to climate risks, and it's going in this direction. So understanding the problem, developing the context, which is typically hyper-local, examining values and goals, because whether some group or religion or color and so on, gender are included or not, normative questions depend on values and the goals, whether safety nets are provided for everybody and not or not, and so on. Developing solutions and enabling inclusive processes. So in the second circle you have going in this direction, understanding the problems, complex risks which require to deal with compounding hazards or quantifying compounding hazards as part of the complex risk, cascading impacts within and across sectors and places, and you have to answer questions outside that we'll look at in a minute. In developing the context, differential vulnerability is very critical. So vulnerability is dynamic, influenced by non-climatic factors such as political power, information access, education, social welfare network or safety net, and so on. Explains gaps between adaptation actions and outcomes. You have to worry about whether adaptation is working as intended. Challenges homogeneity of high risk groups. Okay, so you can't assume even in a city or even in a neighborhood of a city that everybody is experiencing the same level of risk. In examining values and goals, you want to worry about equitable and just adaptation. So centers on marginalized communities, agendas incorporate justice principles. So maybe I should read it correct. Centers, marginalized communities and agendas, incorporates justice principles, highlights historical injustices and systemic inequalities. Certain groups may be systematically underrepresented, not having full agency and facing inequalities over long times. Okay, so this explains for what complex risks and the adaptation action for what. So adaptation theories are on this circle here, and here we are looking at why, differential vulnerability to deal with them, why, and equitable and just adaptation for whom. So pathways approaches then are planning under uncertainty, acknowledging trade-offs. With limited resources you can't put money into everything. Identifies temporality adaptation limits. So temporality is how risks are not fixed or stationary, and they may be increasing or decreasing. Vulnerabilities in some parts of India are actually decreasing because of increased education of women, for example. And proactive decision focused approach, it is about how solution development happens in these pathways approaches. And finally, enabling inclusive processes is about participatory narrative building in terms of adaptation theory. In terms of adaptation actions, it is effective consensus building, collective and localized approaches. Everything is location specific. All global warming is local. links adaptation with development priorities, and it is about how the process, right? So even in terms of financing, adaptation and development priorities are often conflated and mixed or double counted and so on, so you have to be careful about that. Just to read a bit about advances in adaptation research and action. Adaptation research has burgeoned and diversified with several notable advances. We discussed these advances across 4 subsections: how we understand climate risks and vulnerabilities, how we normatively define adaptation outcomes. So these are not analytic questions or strategic questions or tactical questions, but cultural values and norms. What do you hold as sacred, for example? And how we navigate uncertainty to meet goals of effective adaptation. So we can see adaptation pathways in section 2.4 and participatory approaches in 2.5. I'm going to keep it short, unfortunately. Figure 1, which we looked at, synthesizes these advances in climate adaptation research, while others might identify different thematic areas such as enablers, including adaptation finance. Here we highlight these 5 because they capture a range of aspects of adaptation: what we are adapting to, why we are adapting, why are we adapting, and how and when we adapt, laid out in Smith et al. 2000 paper. And secondly, have a well-established conceptual and empirical literature to draw from. And thirdly, they are distinct enough from one another to merit being separate themes. So this is about authors might have gone differently. These authors identify these thematic areas because of these reasons. Okay, jumping ahead, they look at from single hazard to sectoral approaches to complex risk perspectives. So heat wave is not a heat wave for all sectors. For energy, it may be about increased peak demands and meeting those. For vendors, it may be about protecting their produce and protecting themselves, and transportation is about what to do with people who must travel, and so on and so forth. Differential vulnerability mediates adaptive capacities, so this is about poverty, chronic lack of political inclusion, and so on. Goals of equitable and just adaptation have to be very clear. This is where normative questions and societal values come in. Not every culture may provide or include all groups, all religions, and so on. Okay, so jumping ahead, from discrete actions to adaptation pathways. Adaptation theory and practice has moved toward approaches which denote a decision-focused approach to incorporate flexibility into decision making and account for future uncertainty, that build on sequences of flexible, forward-looking actions, anticipate path dependencies, and allow for learning and course correction. These response to critiques of adaptation implementation being reactive, insufficient, and often leading to maladaptive outcomes. So climate change is happening and it's evolving as well, and local impacts are evolving, local demographics, economies are evolving, vulnerabilities are evolving. So pathways are basically charting out future action plan along with what is starting now, with metrics, reporting and verification along the way to make sure that you are being effective and efficient, not only in achieving the goals of adaptation and avoiding maladaptation, but also mainstreaming these into fiscal policies, budgets, and so on, so that they are well funded. Okay. Collective participatory narrative building. Again, I'm just taking snippets. These are long sections. Enabling participation is an integral part of climate change adaptation. Multiple studies show that collectively prioritized and designed adaptations improve adaptation outcomes and achieve what is meant to be. Recent literature goes a step further to advocate for collaboration and co-creation as necessary to deliver transformative adaptation, which means you make step changes in the lifestyles. These are interventions. So unless people are involved in what is coming down for them, maybe in terms of moving, changing houses, changing jobs, traveling in a certain way and so on. So unless they're involved from the beginning, it's unlikely that they will accept the so-called transformative adaptation or any adaptation. While there is consensus that meaningful participation of the most vulnerable and marginalized groups is a key enabler of inclusive adaptation, examining participation by whom, in what, and toward what end is crucial. So if you are thinking of this as future adaptation to make the whole system, community, let's say, resilient, the community is only as resilient as the weakest group. So unless they are also involved in terms of inclusive adaptation, then everybody will be vulnerable, because let's say heat risk makes also a health risk, because in a country like India, heat waves often are associated with diseases, pathogens. Warm temperatures favor blooming pathogens, and if people in your neighborhood are sick, you will get sick as well. There is no way to protect yourself, right? So inclusiveness has got a lot of co-benefits as well. Applying adaptation advances to urban heat risk management, that's the main goal. We apply the above advances in adaptation research to urban heat risk management. Heat risk management solutions in urban areas are a mix of awareness building and informational options, such as improving heat risk perceptions through public awareness campaigns, heat early warnings, health-related do's and don'ts, and so on. And secondly, nature-based options such as enhancing green cover and protecting and enhancing water availability during extreme heat. So heat waves always raise hydration requirements, and you need shelters and hydration centers. Infrastructural options as well in terms of climate sensitive urban planning, heat resilient building design, including passive cooling, solar reflective paint, and so on. There are many ways of using natural circulation, natural light to have buildings be energy efficient while also heat resilient. And behavioral options, of course, changing outdoor labor timings, cultural practices of siesta, reducing social isolation. Old people can feel really isolated during these horrible heat waves, and that can result in enhanced mortality and, of course, productivity loss and morbidities and so on. So applying advances in adaptation theory to urban heat risk management, nice details here. I won't read all of them, but basically you are looking at advances in adaptation theory and implications for urban heat risk management. Let's look at one: from single hazards and sectoral approaches to complex risk perspectives. So adapting a complex risk perspective for urban heat risk management recognizes that urban heat compounds with other hazards such as drought and wildfires, and interacts with non-climate related hazards and shocks. For example, a drought may drive rural population into urban centers, putting heavy pressure on resources. It highlights how the combined effects of these interactions amplify existing systemic vulnerabilities and extend the range of exposed people. For example, intersection of extreme heat with the COVID-19 pandemic. So COVID-19 required separation, quarantine, all those things, but if people are seeking shelter, then you may violate all those requirements. Okay. Also complex risk approaches to risk management can enable better identification of action priorities, improve efficiency of risk management measures, and reduce losses as well. Secondly, differential vulnerability mediates all adaptation. So it considers underlying risk drivers and root causes of vulnerability to heat, acknowledges heat as a social risk as well, demonstrates the need to look beyond classic at-risk vulnerable groups and questions homogeneity within vulnerable populations, demonstrates the relationship between heat risk perception, adaptation capacity, willingness to adapt, and response to heat impacts. This is seen even in harsh winters in the Western world, where homeless people staying outside are being asked to move into shelters to avoid hypothermia and death, but often they don't want to do it because there is violence in shelters that they are scared of. So all kind of complex factors play a role. Equitable and just adaptation, highlighting concerns of thermal equity, by focusing on cooling gap, calls for concerted corrective efforts to enable equitable access to cooling, paying attention to potentially maladaptive outcomes, and so on. From discrete actions to adaptation pathways, highlights that there is a menu of multiple feasible adaptation options, moves away from single solutions to understanding adaptation as a process, centers attention on path dependency and risk of approaching and breaching adaptation limits as well, physical, biological, ecological, and so on. Okay, so implications of the same thing here from discrete actions to adaptation pathways highlights which options have longer lead times and that combinations of actions are more effective to reduce risk, strengthens adaptive capacity and preparedness by thinking through what if scenarios and planning for future change. So pathways are always about crisis management as well as future adaptations that make the entire system heat resilient, right? Collective participatory narrative building emphasizes that participatory approaches are central to inclusiveness. Collective participatory community heat action plans enhance social cohesion as well as adaptive capacity. Narrative based understanding of heat stress and actions can assist in differentiated tailored approaches. Basically, instead of just making it index based, you have narrative based understanding. What experience has been there before, what happens to kids versus older people, women, etc. Co-production and contextualization of scientific knowledge and practices aimed at addressing heat stress, for example, through heat vulnerability mapping, can promote synergetic action plans, which is always critical when you have limited resources. This is the last figure, figure 2. Applying advances in adaptation theory to urban heat risk management to develop heat adaptation pathways are powerful planning and narration tools to sequence discrete actions into solution bundles that can potentially foresee maladaptive outcomes and plan for adaptation limits. So you have attention to differential vulnerability and its interactions with complex risks leading to solution bundles and sequenced as pathways that can have differentiated outcomes. Okay, so here differential vulnerability, as we mentioned, age, gender, socioeconomic status, occupation, nature of employment, complex risks, combining hazard A, B, and C with extreme heat, as we said, droughts, migration, and heat waves, access to hospitals, etc. Solution bundles can be behavior change plus nature-based solutions plus policy changes. Package Y can be infrastructural solutions, shelters, shades, hydration centers, free transportation. So package Z can include informational, nature-based and infrastructural solutions and so on. And pathways can be selective, incremental, hybrid or transformational, drastic changes in the way things are done. So you have a phase space here of outcomes can be equitable, proactive, inequitable on this end. So reactive to proactive, inequitable to equitable. So in this quadrant, equitable and reactive, you are coping but incremental. If you have equitable and proactive, then you have transformational outcome in terms of adaptation for heat risk management. If you are inequitable and yet proactive, then you are coping again and incremental, but the outcomes can be very different for different people if there is inequality in the system. If you are reactive and inequitable, then it can lead to maladaptation. Okay, so basically there are details on how this figure is presented as an approach that must be contextualized to heat risk in certain areas, vulnerable populations in those areas, and the finances and capacities available. When used in conjunction with participatory planning, the approach suggested in figure 2 can help in tangible visualization and prioritization for different stakeholders, particularly by illustrating evidence-based possibilities in adaptation options in the form of relatable extrapolations of present-day interventions. Sounds complicated, but read further if you are interested. I'm jumping ahead to conclusion. Foreseeing the gap between planned and implemented adaptation, Halligat, I think World Bank person, argued for building world narratives for climate change impact, adaptation and vulnerability analysis. In this perspective, we respond to this call focusing on extreme heat risk management in cities. Extreme heat and its differentiated devastating impacts are here to stay, but it's hyperlocal, so you don't know if every region is going to have this issue. However, recognizing this, countries, cities and individuals are piloting a range of heat risk management plans and interventions. However, these remain fragmented, relief-oriented and inadequate when preparing for higher temperatures and possible adaptation limits, which could include human tolerance limits as well. Critically reactive solutions for cooling, such as air conditioners, tend to atomize adaptation action, exacerbating unequal access to cooling and placing the burden of adapting on the most vulnerable. Socioeconomic issues there. Plus, it has a feedback to global warming in the current set of coolants. Such blindness to the political economy of heat risk management also means that individual reactive solutions are necessitated by the absence of systemic, longer-term actions that have large lead times and high initial financial and human resource costs. That is, benefits take time to accrue. For example, demarcating land for green cover and ensuring such bylaws are implemented. So nature-based solutions are easy to say, but how to actually find the space and the resources and sustain them is not any easy at all, right? We draw on the climate change adaptation literature to demonstrate how ongoing heat risk management efforts can be strengthened by paying close attention to how heat interacts with multiple hazards leading to compounding and cascading outcomes, assessing differential vulnerabilities as a crucial precursor to heat adaptation planning, and attention to just and equitable outcomes can preempt maladaptation and promote inclusive adaptations. So the sentence is not it's not formed very well. So participatory approaches enable collective planning and prioritization. For futures-oriented pathways thinking can inform decision-making under uncertainty and plan for adaptation limits. So you say can be strengthened by, and then the sentences are different. We present an approach that can inform urban heat adaptation pathways, drawing on emerging similar exercises. So there are heat narratives, sea level rise, that have similar narratives on heat as well. Such an approach to heat adaptation, we argue, leverages latest adaptation science and can bolster ongoing urban heat risk management to become more sensitive to trade-offs, uncertainty, choices, and sequences and implications of actions. It also brings to bear the importance of developing more nuanced understandings of the hazard of heat, a renewed focus on differential vulnerability within cities, and the need for building capacities around how to sequence and bundle groups of short-term and long-term actions in a way that is most effective and equitable and also efficient. In practice, our approach can be fine-tuned to different regions and context based on their priorities, heat exposure and thresholds, vulnerabilities and capacities. Mortality for heat waves are very different in the warm countries versus cooler countries in mid-latitudes, for example. How heat risk management and adaptation planning will play out depend also on urban planning approaches, priorities and available finances, all of which are deeply mediated by urbanization trajectories and agendas. Overall, heat adaptation pathways that acknowledge the compounding and cascading nature of hazards and risks, center equity and differential vulnerabilities, are underpinned by procedural and normative goals of inclusiveness and sequence solutions with an eye on future scenarios of increasing heat risks are necessary in an urbanizing warm world. The sentences are a bit awkward, but let's leave it there. Okay, so please go and read the paper. It's very nice, and this is already 30 minutes, so I'm going to stop here, and the next topic will likely be something else. I will look up later. Okay, see you.